Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here with another episode of Fixing the Forgotten, the series where we discuss a specific faction's underperforming, underwhelming, or underutilized units, lords, heroes, and regiments of renown, and talk about what could be done to make them a bit more appealing, a bit more useful, or a bit more competitive in multiplayer. And in this video today, we are going to be discussing the forces of Fair Brettonia. And as you can see by the lineup here, there is not very much that we're going to be discussing here. Several of the units that actually made the cut last time are no longer here, and I think Brettonia has perhaps seen one of the biggest jumps in faction performance since the last Fixing Forgotten, going from what could best be described as a subpar and perhaps outright bad faction compared to most of its peers to being a very competitive and arguably one of the strongest factions in the game at the moment, especially if one knows how to use them and when played correctly. And that, however, does not mean that there are not some stinkers. Much of the Brettonian performance and arguably overperformance at the moment really hinges on a handful of units. Pox arrows, which are just kind of overtuned right now. Units like the Enchantress, Questing Knights, of course, one of the most egregiously underpriced units in the game. Stuff like that all works together to make Brettonia very competitive. However, there are some stinkers, and if those units are to get nerfs, I do think some of these units could still stand to get some mild tweaks or perhaps even more significant buffs. So going over the lineup here, we're going to start with the Lords as usual. And for the Lords, there's only two here, and one of them is Réponse de Lyonesse. Now, this lady has had some improvements to her performance over the last couple months. Most importantly, she actually has normal Brettonian Lord speed now on horseback, sitting at 75, which is respectable. Certainly not the most mobile character out there, but more than adequate for a budget fighty Lord. She does, of course, have solid, if not amazing, AP performance, some decent bonus versus infantry mixed in there, and all in all, just passable combat stats. 110 armor is very respectable, 3600 HP. However, she's still lacking, in my opinion, a little bit of the oomph to make her a solid Lord's choice. She's definitely, I feel, a bit underwhelming compared to, of course, the Enchantress or Lewin, for example, but even compared to, say, Bordelot or a Prophetess, she lacks, I think, a bit of a niche, and could stand to get some tweaks to make her more competitive. Now, first and foremost, the Fleur de Lis banner is, in my opinion, excellent. 40 meter AoE, plus 9 melee attack and defense, even though it's restricted to melee only, is pretty insane. I don't really think there's much that you can go wrong with there. It's a very solid buff. Her Sword of Lyonesse, also respectable, I think. At 120 second cooldown, you get 24 seconds of a huge boost to weapon strength and melee attack. However, the Halo of Maidenly Wrath is one of those abilities I feel could use a tweak. Something to make her a little bit more appealing, and something that would give her a second support ability. Right now, the way Halo of Maidenly Wrath works, it's kind of like Cetra's Wrath of Tra, where you detonate and knocks back nearby enemies, and does a bit of damage, and implies the blinded effect. However, that blinded effect only lasts 10 seconds, which is kind of lackluster. It means you can't really use it to, say, snipe a character or really break a front line, because you don't get a very long duration on that blinded. And so what I'd perhaps like to see changed on the Halo of Maidenly Wrath is, if we're not going to lower the cooldown maybe to 90 seconds or something so you can drop it a bit more often, is make it so that the blinded effect becomes something attached to your melee attacks for, say, a 30-second duration or something along those lines. Perhaps soup up the item's cost, maybe make it a purple or a rare item, but in exchange, make it so you can apply blinded for an extended period of time. That would help Réponse single out a specific target, help her support her troops a bit, make it so that at least in the center point where Réponse is fighting, she can really prop up her nearby troops. Especially, one of her big synergies right now is with, say, Foot Squires, who don't have the best combat stats. Fleur de Lis banner kind of offsets that. If Halo of Maidenly Wrath provided a consistent melee attack and defense debuff, it would, I think, in turn, make Réponse a little bit more of an appealing character. I don't think she's ever going to be a sort of top-tier pick unless Faye and Lewin got completely dumpstered. Even then, Bordelot would have to get nerfed quite a bit. But I do think she could be given her a little bit of an enhanced niche there, just by making it so she can debuff enemies a little bit more consistently and a little bit more effectively. Next up, moving on to the generic Brettonian Lord. This guy, I think, is no surprise that he made the cut here, and yeah, the Brettonian Lord kind of sucks. Much like the Empire General, he just lacks an outstanding characteristic. I want to say he's a budget somebody, but he really isn't even a budget version of, say, Lewin or Bordello. I actually think that were it not for the Leoness subfaction, this guy would have basically no usage whatsoever. And he's probably, at least in my opinion, I would rate this guy as worse in the Brettonian faction than the Empire General is within the Empire faction. That's how bad I would rate this guy. Combat stats, whether on horseback or on griffin back or hippogriff back, not very good no matter what. He doesn't have the best of leadership, doesn't have immunity psychology on horseback. He does get, I guess, fear and terror here on the hippogriff, but not the best resilience there. Armor sits at 90, which is okay, but nothing to write home about. Kind of mediocre HP and all that stuff. Perhaps a little bit better than, say, an Empire General in raw stats, but he doesn't get the insane sniping item with Reikland Runefang. You get just the sort of anti-heroes, which is kind of meh. Deadly Onslaught and Foe Seeker, stand your ground, kind of the usual fare, and Crown of Command to potentially keep units in the fight. The problem is as Brettonians, you don't really want a Crown of Command. Brettonia has a massive dichotomy in its units. Units like archers and peasants and those sorts of units are not units you want to be bringing a Crown of Command for. They're garbage. Their leadership's terrible. They're going to rout near instantly anyway. So trying to time a Crown of Command perfectly to prevent that unit from routing is very difficult. Plus, it's kind of not worth it for such cheap and disposable units. At the same time, your cavalry, most of the cavalry you're going to be using has immunity psychology, some pretty insane leadership, even if they don't. Knights of the Realm, for example, have more leadership than Reichsguard, despite being a much cheaper unit. So Brettonian Cav, arguably a bit overtuned in the leadership department, and as a result, what's the point of a Crown of Command? You're not really worried about your units routing. So what could be done about the Lord? First and foremost, I think he could be given a little bit more utility, something to make him, once again, much like the Empire General, a little bit more of a support character. I do think the Brettonian Lord should be a bit more combat oriented, rather than the Empire General, because Brettonians are all about their monster hunting and their fighting. It's definitely a big part of their lore and sort of faction culture. But I do think you could see something like Heartpiercer, for example, that the Blood Dragon Lord gets for the Vampire counts, being given to the Lord. Something along those lines. Something that debuffs enemy armor, allows your non-AP knights, such as Grail Knights, Knights of the Realm, Knights Errant, Pegasus Knights, perform a bit better, and also allows him to perform a little bit better, of course, because armor debuffs help you too. And at the same time, something that is a bit unique to him. At the moment, Brettonia is a faction that really lacks armor sundering. It's sort of an item that their faction doesn't really have. And so I think it would be neat to have, besides Lewin with his sort of Corone, and of course the Lord of Heavens, the Curse of the Midnight Wind. That's all the armor sundering you get. So having a Lord as an option, as a cheap way to get some armor sundering on the field, I think would be pretty neat. Would be a cool and unique twist on him, make him a bit more combat effective. Otherwise, perhaps I think he could get immunity psychology when he's mounted on, at least on a horseback or a Pegasus back, something, and perhaps some slightly tweaked stats just to make him a little bit more of a fighty commander. After all, Brettonians their big gimmick is supposed to be the fact that they're good single fighters or individual fighters, rather than being a sort of super organized and disciplined army. But some small tweaks like that. Otherwise, if CA wanted to do bigger reworks, I could see some sort of virtue or chivalric virtue ability being added. Perhaps you could have virtue of empathy to make your nearby infantry a bit more effective, boost in Brettonian infantry units, make them more combat powerful, such as foot squires or battle pilgrims in particular. Soup those units up. Perhaps have some abilities that specifically target cavalry, and you could have these being exchanged, or perhaps a virtue that affects the Lord specifically. And you could have these as, you can just pick one of them, but it will allow you to sort of customize your Lord and customize your playstyle there. Now, moving on to the heroes, we do have two here on the field, and one isn't really here because she deserves to be, in my opinion. It's more just because one of her items or abilities really sucks, and that's the R of the Lady on the Damsel, as was the Prophetess for that matter. I didn't include the Prophetess here, but same effect. R of the Lady, it's a garbage ability. 12% magic resist in a 30-meter AoE. It is a dirt cheap item, but it's kind of pointless. It requires you to put your caster in harm's way to really maximize its value. It does not stop Spirit Leech from sniping cavalry models. So if you're worried about your Knights of or your Companions of Canal or your Grail Knights or whatever the case may be, if you're worried about any of them getting sniped by Spirit Leech, Aura of the Lady is not saving you. It is not going to deny Hammer of Witches from killing off models. It is not going to provide a significant boost if you're fighting a magic damage weaponry. Maybe if you're in a grind against like Fireborn with Alariel standing nearby, maybe this is kind of nifty. It makes them do 12% less damage, but really in practice, it's just such a garbage item. And I would like to see it reworked. Personally, what I would like to see, it probably is it made a castable item that has a certain amount of range, perhaps 100 meter or so range, and would grant a 25% magic resist. The reason for that is because it would allow you to negate Spirit Leech effects. And so you could potentially, and I shouldn't say negate, but it would allow you to resist Spirit Leech effects. So if your opponent is trying to snipe out your cavalry with a Spirit Leech type effect, you could have a 60 or 90 second cooldown item that prevents models from dying per tick. And it would be something that rewards your micro a little bit, rewards response time, and sort of a mild dispel effect in some ways, and could give the Aura of the Lady some usefulness. Because if you're going against a faction that could bring Spirit Leech as an ability against you, boom, you can counter it with Aura of the Lady. Otherwise, make the effect of range bigger, make it a 40 or even 55 meter effect, make it imbue greater magic resist, 20 or even 25%, I think could be good. Or perhaps make it improve. You could perhaps make it do something like improve leadership a little bit to nearby troops, so it can synergize a bit better with cavalry, with infantry. Help keep your bowmen in line, for example, if they're near your damsel, stuff like that. Obviously, it is meant to be resisting enchantments, but perhaps you could do something where it even resists missile damage, for example. Maybe make that way you could just make some of your backline a little bit tankier against a mortar fire or enemy archery, whatever the case may be. I think there's some tweaks that could be done to the Aura of the Lady, but personally, I'd just like to see it made into a point-and-click ability effect that does enough magic resist to negate Spirit Leech. Now, moving on to the Paladin, this is a character who I'd like to see reworked and in some ways nerfed, actually. I actually think right now he's probably overtuned for his cost. So a bit of an oddball here. I don't usually include units I think should be nerfed in Fixing the Forgotten, but in this case, I think it should be mentioned. I do think he should lose Guardian. I don't think Guardian should have ever been put on Paladin. I think it's a bit of a goofy choice. If any unit should have Guardian, it's the Grail Guardians. And I think Paladin just shouldn't have Guardian. But I think he should be a better fighter. Brettonian's entire gimmick is the fact that they're insanely good fighters. Their martial prowess is a big thing for them. And I would like to see the Paladin reworked to reflect that a bit better. I would like to see him get immunity to vigor. He's a Gleaming Grail Knight over here. He's got a magic sword and everything, and he's not immune to vigor. Give him perhaps magic attacks as well, but that's a little bit less of a priority. And then give him some, if we're not going to go with vows, though vows could be cool for this guy as well, just have some chivalric vows for Paladin. I would like to see him get perhaps his combat stats tweaked upward, perhaps get another 5 melee attack and defense, something to make him a little fightier, obviously with some price increases to go along with that. And then give him some combat-oriented ability. Right now, it's once again, it's one of those Warhammer 1 hero syndrome effects, I feel like, where Warhammer 2 and characters that have been properly reworked into Warhammer 2, like for example the Goblin Big Boss, now have certain effects to hone them into their desired role. And for the Paladin, who's supposed to be a big monster fighter, who's supposed to be a big sort of combat. He's supposed to be the champion who's seeking out key targets on the battlefield and looking to smite them in the name of the Lady and Elysian Lord and all that sort of thing. But his stats don't really reflect that. He's got kind of potato tier combat stats, though a fairly generous AP ratio. He doesn't have immunity to vigor, even though he's a Grail Knight, pretty obviously. He doesn't have and he doesn't have any really great abilities to improve his dueling potential. He's got Charmed Shield, which is all right. But I could see him losing, for example, Potion of Foolhardiness, obviously Guardian, and gaining 2 items that make him a bit stronger of a fighter. For example, you could get the Potion of Strength, which would be a little bit better for sniping out an enemy character, and then perhaps a targetable debuff, or perhaps more, I'd say I'd prefer a self buff. This guy can be tossed on a Pegasus, so you can be pretty mobile. Give him some sort of ability, like worthy foe or something along those lines. Could even be done along the lines of Grimgore, where if you're near an enemy character, you get an extra boost to your, say, speed, charge bonus, and melee attack, rather than defensive buffs that Grimgore gets for being the best of the best. Could get something where it's an ability you proc to close the gap a bit faster, something that boosts your charge bonus, boosts your speed, boosts your weapon strength by, say, 50%, like a something relatively potent self buff, and perhaps an expensive self buff, but something that really helps reflect that the Paladin is supposed to be this hunter of champions. Otherwise, perhaps a heart piercer effect could also go in for this guy, though I'm not sure. I'd be a little worried about sort of double armor sundering builds from Brettonians, keeping that armor sundering effect chained, though at the same time you do already kind of see that in other factions, so I don't know if it would be that much of a concern, but definitely would like to see the Paladin made more into a fighter rather than this weird bodyguard budget combat hero. I think it would make him more balanced too. He wouldn't be as cheap and affordable in a Doom squad, and he wouldn't be a really cheap way of making Fan Enchanters near indestructible, but could be a better fighting character in builds that require. Now moving on to the infantry, as you can see, that is the largest segment being represented here. We do have the Grey Relique first and foremost. I'm sure nobody is surprised to see this bad boy hitting the field in another Fixing the Forgotten. And that's because it hasn't been changed since the last Fixing the Forgotten. It is the same kind of potato tier unit it was then. And the Grey Relique's biggest problem really is that where the Brettonian roster changed, it did not. It's really mostly gotten buffs since Warhammer 2 dropped. Its effect was actually increased to have a greater AoE. It did lose a little bit of a leadership buff, but it got a greater AoE. It got much cheaper. It did get, I believe, a slight. I believe it might have gotten some slight decrease in HP, but really, it mostly got buffs. Especially getting cheaper and having a much greater AoE on the effect, you'd think it would be better. But the problem is, Brettonian infantry got way worse. Back in Warhammer 1 days, at one point, foot squires were literally just great swords with low armor. That also cost 200 less, and that is clearly no longer the case. And so, yeah, the Grey Relique kind of lost a lot of its charm there, and I think it needs some sort of buff. I think, first and foremost, the straightest buff would be a straight cost decrease. Drop its cost down to 250, like a Corpse Cart, and you would probably see some Grey Reliques. The fact that this unit costs such an obscene amount of money to put on the field and support some very not good infantry is, yeah, a bit jarring, and a big reason not to bother with the Grey Relique in the first place. So maybe if it was just dirt cheap, it would work. Otherwise, if CA does want to keep it as a bit more of an expensive support option, I think there's other ways to go about it. You could have it imbue Frenzy, perhaps, to nearby units, or some sort of knockoff Frenzy effect into nearby units. Perhaps you could have a staggered effect like Drycha's, where the Grey Relique, as it takes damage in combat, it gets a progressively increasing effect. You could start with a very small effect initially, say, I don't know, like +3 melee attack, +3 melee defense, or something for nearby units, and that could go up by another +3 through each 25% phase of its HP pool. So you start off at +3/+3, and you end up at +12/+12, for example, which is a pretty monstrous effect when you think about it. But it would mean that if the unit gets ignored, it doesn't necessarily get that much value, but it would at least have some additional effect to nearby troops. And being slow like this, it's still not really something you rely on to support cavalry. It's still more of an infantry support tool. But something like that could certainly work. Could certainly work as in my opinion, as a way to make the Grey Relique a little bit more appealing. Otherwise, just straight combat buffs, make it imbue nearby units with Frenzy, make it imbue nearby units with better combat stats, like the Vigor Mortis effect, +5/+5. Obviously not something like Balefire Corpse Cart, but perhaps boost nearby units charge bonus. You could have that. But really, I just think it needs to have either additional effects or just be way cheaper. If you're going to be a straight leadership buff bot, then I think this thing needs to be dirt cheap. And if it's not, much like the Corpse Guard is dirt cheap because its only function is to be a melee stat buff bot for nearby infantry, really. Real Relique is basically a leadership buff bot for nearby infantry. And I don't think it deserves to be cost above 250 gold. At this moment, it's basically twice what it should cost. But otherwise, if the CA wants to get a bit more cute or a bit more clever with how to rework it, I can think of several ways that could be done. And I think a mechanic like Drisha is where you just take damage and it improves the stats over as you take damage. I think would be pretty cool way of buffing nearby troops, and kind of thematic as the peasants get angered and horrified by their virtuous knightly hero here getting destroyed, even though he's already kind of dead. Moving on to Battle Pilgrims, not much for these guys. I think they're in a reasonable spot right now on the Brettonian roster. I don't think they're OP or underpowered, really, by too much. I think they could use a slight upward tweak in mobility. I think that for a sort of aggressive rushing infantry, I think 30 speed is very, very low. And I think they could use with 33 or even 36 speed. Just make them a bit more mobile, a bit more like flagellants in that sense, where if you do bust the front line, they can pressure a back line okay. Something that can push the front a bit faster without overbuffing their combat stats here, because their combat stats aren't really that great. You are, but they do get quite decent with Frenzy, and you are, of course, paying for that excellent leadership of 80 on the Brettonian roster. So I think 600 gold is mostly fair. I just wish these guys were a little bit more mobile, a little bit more flexible, and I think that could be done by giving them an extra 3 or 6 speed or so. Moving on to Foot Squires, I do think these guys have come quite a long way from where they were earlier. They certainly were a total trash unit for the price before. Now I still think they're a bit underpowered. I think one of the big problems for the Foot Squires is the relatively low HP for a somewhat expensive unit at 6,200. Obviously, I know I can already hear the Wood Elves or the Elf players just in general screaming, well, my troops have trash HP too, and yes, that is true. But they tend to have excellent stats to offset that. Foot Squires have pretty bad armor, pretty bad HP, and all in all, not the best leadership. So I think it would be good or prudent to give them a little bit more armor. Bump that armor up to, say, 80, make them a little bit beefier against non-AP units, because right now they do tend to get mulched even by Berserker units, even worse than Greatswords do, because 70 armor is just not such good protection. It's a tiny bit better than Saurus. It's really not something to write home about. And I do think the Foot Squires there could get a little bit of a boost that way. Otherwise, because they are a bit more lightly armored for a quote-unquote heavy infantry, maybe buff their speed up to 30, make them a little bit nippier, a little bit more mobile and responsive. The last recommendation I could think of is to give them more HP, but I don't really think that should be necessary. I think the lower HP makes sense for a less elite faction, but certainly I think some slight tweaks to either speed or preferably, in my opinion, armor would be nice. Just make them a little bit beefier. And finally, we do have the Beastlayers of Bastogne. Now, this is a unit that I was pretty fond of, but especially with the changes to Brettonia's roster, the improvements to questing knights, these guys have become much less of an important unit in my mind. They certainly kind of fallen off. Also, compared to a lot of other halberd units, and I know a lot of people didn't like these guys before, and compared to a lot of halberd units in their price range, they're not particularly good, even when and especially when you consider they're a one-off regiment renown. You can't get a bunch of units of Beastlayers of Bastogne the way you can get several chosen with, or Chaos Warriors with great weapons, or Tomb Guard with halberds. Chaos Warriors with halberds, or Tomb Guard with halberds. You got one Beastlayer of Bastogne, and their stats are not very good. Their stats are arguably worse than, say, Chaos Warriors with halberds. They're arguably worse than Tomb Guard, especially because they don't have a shield. So what could be done to improve these guys, make them a little bit better for their cost? Well, you could make them a little bit cheaper. You could drop their cost to, say, 800, which I'm not the biggest fan of, just because I feel that that's kind of a lazy way to fix, especially a unit that should be unique, like a Regiment of Renown. I feel like Lords and Regiments of Renown should generally get something fancier, get something a little bit more unique to spice them up. But I think a few things that could be done here: give them immunity to psychology. They're supposed to be Beast Slayers, so give them immunity to psychology. That's supposed to be their shtick here. Could give them a little bit more armor, bump that armor up to 90 or maybe even 100. Just make them a bit more resilient, a bit more beefy, a bit more tanky, especially by Brettonian infantry standards. Make that a sort of like how Stormervin might be for Skaven. Make this the rare unit. I get that Stormervin are a generic unit you can field, but bear with me here. Make the Beastlayer a heavier line infantry you can kind of rely on to hold the front. Maybe give them expert charge defense. I know that's a pretty common trait for halberd units, but it could be something to make the Beastlayers a little bit more appealing, help offset those meh stats. They've got very nice melee defense, but fairly meh melee attack and lackluster weapon strength, especially against infantry. Because 25 weapon strength is nothing to write home about. It's basically like Eternal Guard, even though you do get a hefty AP component there. And it gets almost double against large, but still, it does mean that they kind of struggle to perform against other infantry. Perhaps buff their weapon strength and cut the bonus versus large a little bit. Maybe bump the melee attack up to 30, weapon strength up to 30, and then cut the bonus versus large to 17. Makes them a little worse against large, though not by much, but makes them a little bit more consistent against infantry. Something like that, I think, would make the Beastlayers a little bit more appealing. Immune psychology, though, I definitely think would be flavorful and make sense. Same with an armor buff. I think it would be nice. They do, after all, have helmets, and I guess those helmets are already providing extra 10 armor over foot squires, but could bump it up a little bit further, maybe. Even though these guys clearly haven't figured out that armoring your arms is in fact useful. And finally, we do have the Wardens of Montfort, Regiment Renown, Mounted Yeomen. Despite the poison changes, I actually still think these guys are kind of bad. I know that might be a little controversial, but arguably with the poison changes, these guys are even worse because the ability to position your poison unit matters even less, since friendly fire is no longer important. You shoot your own knights, who gives a crap? You're not poisoning them anyway. So Wardens of Montfort, I think, need a buff all the more now. They're 750 gold unit. Compare them to Glade Riders with Hagbane tips, and these guys are a potato tier unit. They've got nothing going for them except, I guess, 15 armor. But they're pretty freaking terrible compared to Glade Riders. And once again, keep in mind, this is a Regiment Renown, which tend to be kind of underpriced for their performance usually, and that's certainly not the case here. Few recommendations I could think of is make them poison and melee. So they can support a fight even after they're out of their relatively low ammo count. Second, give them combat stats on par with regular mounted yeomen, much like the Regiment Renown. Illyrian Reaver archers are comparable to normal Illyrian Reavers in melee. Make these guys a okay for their price combat unit rather than remaining a garbage melee unit. The only thing they've got better than normal mounted yeomen is charge bonus. Maybe you could boost up their armor a little bit, give them, say, 50 armor, make them a little tankier, though probably not my go-to there. Could give them a little bit more range, but really what I would like to see is boost up their melee attack and maybe give them poison and melee, just to give them a little bit more utility and reliability there, especially in a protracted game. Otherwise, cut their cost down, because honestly, this unit should probably set around 650, I think, if it was fairly priced. At 750, it's just grossly underpriced, but that's just my 2 cents there. I'm sure there's some units here that might be surprising not to see. Green Knight didn't make the cut because I think the Green Knight has improved a lot and is actually now a bit of a decent niche pick. At 1800 gold, he's not the worst thing in the world. Blessed Field Trebuchet is another one I'm sure some people are questioning. Blessed Field Trebuchet didn't make the cut because it's also gotten, in my opinion, a niche. Now that it has a very high splash that doesn't actually do friendly fire, I think it's got a bit of a niche in the counter battery roll. And I think it's got a bit of a niche in supporting the front line and knocking out demigriffs with its high single model damage. It definitely has matchups where it can shine. And I guess the final unit that might be a bit curious here, Mounted Yeomen. I think these guys, and Grail Guardians, I think both of these units are pretty solid at the moment. Grail Guardians I think have always been a bit solid, just kind of niche and undermined in function by the arguably overpowered Paladin and Gotrek bodyguard combo for the Fae. But I think Grail Guardians are still a solid unit for the price. And Mounted Yeomen have actually, in my opinion, become competitive with their stat changes. So that's why they didn't make the cut here either. But as always, guys, feel free to share your thoughts, opinions, comments, and critiques down below. I'll do my best to respond as soon as I can. I do thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.